What I want to do today is almost about 3 decades, taking a look back on neoliberalism and its effect on health. And what I'll be trying to do is really look at what are the ways and the processes that have been unleashed through neoliberalism and what it has done to the health sector today. So, firstly, I want to say that neoliberalism is not a new term for this audience, and we have all used it in various ways in the work that we do, whether we are working at the grassroots levels or we are engaged with academic research. But I just thought it would be useful to unpack neoliberalism to understand how we use this particular term. One, we use it as an ideological hegemonic project. Two, we also use it as a policy and program. So this is where you really look at issues around privatization, marketization, and also you look at the role of international organizations like the IMF, World Bank, WTO, WHO. And then the third is you really look at the rolling back of the state, or rather the restructuring of state and its relation to the market. And the fourth being neoliberalism as governmentality, ways in which relations between people and the state are reimagined and reconfigured. So I think we have used neoliberalism in many of these ways, sometimes together and sometimes rather separate in the analysis that we undertake. Now, in a lot of the writings on neoliberalism and health, all these various aspects have been employed. But the core of neoliberalism is the liberalization of market forces for both social distribution and personal motivation. So when you look at health, you find that neoliberalism has been used to understand how market forces have reshaped both the determinants of health, both in terms of the health system determinants and the health service determinants. And what is very important is what are the various pathways through which this kind of reconfiguration and transformation that has occurred in the health sector. Now, some scholars, especially in India, have given a great deal of emphasis to the role of global actors. And if you go back to the writings in the 1990s, especially with the World Bank and the IMF coming in for the structural adjustment program, there's been a lot of critical writing on what the neoliberal agenda has done and how it has been furthered by the World Bank and IMF in restructuring health services in India. A lot of the emphasis was, of course, on health services because the World Bank, in its interaction with the health sector, was focusing on restructuring health services. Now, a lot of these writings have been done from an impositional perspective. So you are looking at how the World Bank and IMF came in with certain conditionalities and forced the Indian government. Some of the writing has looked at it in terms of coercing or forcing the Indian state to adapt these policies. But I think we need to today take a much more nuanced understanding of it, because when you have an impositional perspective, you don't give agency to the state at all. And I think that we should look at the Indian state not as a puppet state. And I make this distinction because if you look at a lot of the African countries where the role of the World Bank has been very significant, the military dictatorships, the various other forms of what I would call non-democratic governments have in a sense accepted conditionalities of the World Bank totally. And for example, Zambia sort of went in for health sector reforms and privatized their health services almost within a very short period. But in the Indian case, you find that the Indian state was very much a part of this whole process. The Indian elite, the bureaucracy, the medical bureaucracy, and the political class were very much in sync with neoliberal ideology even before the World Bank came in and, of course, furthered the agenda. Now, I think I want to make this point precisely because I think for strategic reasons it was very important to talk about the role of the World Bank. It brought civil society, academia together to resist the onslaught of World Bank policies. However, the Indian state, right from the late 1970s, and if you look at the end of the Indira Gandhi era and beyond, you find that many of these neoliberal ideas were already in circulation, and the government was moving more and more towards accepting a neoliberal ideology, and 1991 becomes, in a sense, the marker for neoliberal policies in India. So what we are really seeing, and I don't want to repeat this because everyone in the audience knows, so you had already an underfunded, weak public sector and a growing, aggressively growing private sector, and you had all the, if you like, the necessary and sufficient conditions for neoliberalism to take root in the Indian context. Now, what you really find is that an important area where the effects of neoliberal policies were visible was clearly in the area of health services. And here I want to use the concept of commercialization because, in a sense, what happens when you look at privatization is you look at the private sector as independent of the public sector, and you don't even look at what's happening to the non-profit sector. So what commercialization, I attribute this idea and this concept to the work of Maureen McIntosh and later Maureen McIntosh and Mary Koivusulu, where they actually bring in the ideas of marketization, privatization and personal payment systems together under this rubric of commercialization, because they argue that actually market forces not only reconfigure public services, they also reconfigure the role of the private sector or for-profit sector and the non-profit sector. And these are not, watertight boundaries. They're in fact porous, they are interactive, and therefore the whole project of commercialization brings together the seamless ways in which capital moves across these three sectors. So as I mentioned before, what happens is that we know, and there is a sufficient body of work, and a lot of that work has been done by my colleagues in the Center of Social Medicine and Community Health, where we have looked at what kind of reforms were instituted in public institutions, the introduction of user fees, the whole idea of the division between the public good and the private good, the spaces that were created for markets in terms of what could be handled by the for-profit sector and what should be handled by the state. So the entire liberal view of separating the role of the curative and the preventive, etc., was complete, and the World Bank, of course, the conditionalities in the World Development Report as it's articulated is very well known, and it was accepted. Now, this ideas of the World Bank was also found salience and an echo within the political class, the medical bureaucracy, and the bureaucrats. So you cannot say that this policy just happened. I think there was a very clear and an active engagement of the state in the processes that unfolded. Now, what really happened after about 2 decades, and there is global data as well as the Indian data, which showed that with the commercialization of health services, the question of inequities became very important. And it was the inequities were really seen through the lens of rising out-of-pocket expenditures and catastrophic expenditures, and also that untreated morbidities because of the inability to pay. Now, the National Sample Survey, I don't have much time, but the National Sample Survey clearly various rounds points to this. Now, therefore, both globally and nationally, rising inequities was a concern, and this became a concern, and so you had the MDGs, you then now have the SDGs. So the entire response was to improve coverage. So, when you look at the state response to the rising inequities in healthcare, it is to say that let's have more insurance, let's have more targeted insurance to sort of improve coverage and to reduce out-of-pocket expenditures. So already the entire discourse has shifted from any ideas that, say, the Alma Ata Declaration had discussed. In a very short span of time, the idea of a universal, comprehensive healthcare had certainly been, the goalposts had been shifted. Now, what is very important, I think, about this whole neoliberal agenda is that the commercialization which has been written about has largely focused on the public and the for-profit sectors. But I think what was happening, which hasn't got adequate attention, is what was happening to the transformation of NGOs and the CSOs, I mean the civil society organizations. I'm making this distinction because to me civil society is not just NGOs. Civil society is also about political parties, it is about trade union movements, it's about various social movements that have come together that have often resisted the onslaught of neoliberalism. Now, I think the transformation took place, I would put an important marker for this transformation was the World Bank and IMF's programs to partner with NGOs for disease control programs like, AIDS, TB. So you find that a number of, the growth of NGOs and the spawning of NGOs really takes place with a large funding that comes in for this kind of activity. And with the change in funding patterns, the priorities of NGOs also changed. And I could see this happening when I was in the VHAI. There's a Voluntary Health Association. Erstwhile smaller grassroots organizations that were trying to, really work with the people with an ideology which was, broadly radical, Gandhian, left, whatever. There's a plurality of ideological positions. Soon as the funding positions changed, they also changed the priorities. So they were no longer reflecting or were forced to change their priorities. So you started seeing that change happening even before the World Bank came, and this got accelerated. It was also a period when I think the ideological differences within the civil society organizations also started coming to the forefront. Now, this is a very important area of transformation because we often think that the CSOs are a homogeneous entity, that they have always played the role of resisting neoliberal agenda. But if you look at more recent literature, and I'll come to that a little later, it really is showing you an extremely fractured landscape of, ideologically fractured landscape of the civil society organizations. So the neoliberalism itself has faced its crisis. Now that is also very important when we are looking at the relationship between neoliberalism and health. So you have the Asian economic crisis of 1997, you have the global financial crisis of 2007. It is in a sense has weakened the aggressive pace of neoliberalism. And if you see today a Piketty writing about rising inequalities or earlier Stiglitz writing about discontents of globalization, you already saw a body of work coming from people who are advocates of neoliberalism. I'm not talking about Piketty, but certainly Stiglitz and others who were talking about what are the kinds of fault lines and the question of inequality was a major concern. And I often asked myself, why is it a major concern for global capital? And in a recent article, I saw that actually a globalized market has excluded the interaction of almost about 18% of the global population from accessing markets because they just don't have money to access those markets. So you are now again resurrecting the debate about inequality and poverty and those who are left out. Now this left out debate is really set, the terms of that debate is being set by the market because these are the sections of population that you are unable to access. Now this is also a period in the Indian context where the funding for NGOs has decreased because the bilaterals are no longer an important player. The World Bank has in a sense receded from this whole picture. So where are the NGOs? What has happened to this scenario in present times? Now the other very interesting aspect is that when we look at commercialization, we are looking at the public sector, we are looking at the for-profit, we are looking at the CSOs, but the corporations themselves are reinventing themselves. And one of the ways in which the corporations are reinvented, both global and national, is by resurrecting the corporate social responsibility arm of, and the corporate social responsibility is not a new idea at all, but it has now got a new life. And I'm going to use 2-3 examples to talk about this. When you look at the major food corporations, since we are talking about health, you take the case of Coca-Cola Foundation, and I think the professor from Ecuador spoke about this, the Coca-Cola Foundation, the Monsanto Foundation. These are two interesting examples for the Indian context because they are working in areas which are outside health services. You're looking at water, you're looking at a range of other products which have a direct impact on health. And what you find with the Coca-Cola Foundation in India is it partners with NGOs, and NGOs whom you would at one point in history were seen as radical NGOs. And it was very interesting in a recent paper I've done, and the details are there. The Coca-Cola Foundation in India is called Anandana. It partners with, the major partner is Banker Roy's Thilonia Group, where Barefoot College, etc. And Banker Roy sits on the Coca-Cola Foundation as a board member. So what we are really trying, what I'm basically trying to show you is that there is an engagement with the civil society organization and the foundations. And I think Anne Emmanuel will talk a lot more from the global perspective on this. What is also very important for us to understand is, for example, Monsanto partners with Akshay Patra, which is a feeding program for school children. They run kitchen gardens, and they also partner with Pradhan. We have friends in Pradhan. I mean, I'm not trying to make a conspiratorial argument here, but I'm basically trying to show you that even the civil society organizations have not been free of the influences of corporations and of neoliberal policies. And I think what we need to understand in this scenario is that the way in which these partnerships are forged are really, in a sense, to address the fact that there is a large percentage of population who are poor and who cannot really access global markets. So the global markets reconfigure themselves to access the poor. And the way in which they do it is they use local NGOs to partner. And as if you all, I'm sure, familiar with C.K. Prahlad's work in the 70s, the race to the bottom of the pyramid. So what you're really using is those ideas, and the CSOs themselves are in a sense divided. There is literature on this which is showing you that globally there are NGOs who are pro-status, there are NGOs who are resistors to this entire neoliberal agenda, but there is what you call the middle space. Yeah, I'm finishing. The middle space, which is actually engaging with corporations, and the argument is, or with markets, saying that we have to use the market to improve the conditions of the poor. So this kind of an argument gives legitimacy to the kinds of partnerships that we are seeing evolving over time. So I think what I would like to really say is that it's very important for young academics to understand the nuances and the way in which transformations are happening. And the transformation is not linear. It is actually very complicated, and one feeds into the other. And the role of the state becomes really modified to meet the needs of capital, both national and global. Thank you very much.